First of all, those were amazing presentation. Very successful people who have very unique businesses that may apply to some of you and some of you may not. Every company, every startup, whether you're mobile, you're SaaS, your commerce, is going to be very different. Depends where you start in your company. It depends, if you can raise money. It depends on, again, your market segment. And it depends how long you've been doing it. I've done 6 startups already. And so I've had the luxury to fail many times to ultimately, hopefully, get around to being successful at some point. We had done actually 30 plus games before Draw Something became a monster hit, which included 2 other versions, including on the web as well as Facebook. And we were, despite all the cash we raised, running out of cash after 4 or 5 years in business. And originally, OMG Pot was actually a dating app. It was a dating website. It was meant to match people real time. I actually spent, I believe it was $62,000. This is about 3 years ago now. So playing the algorithms in the app stores was a really big part of growing because what you wanted to do based on how the app store was still designed, which is you wanted to get in front of the page. It's like retailing. You want to be at the entrance or at the right spot of a retail environment. And so being in the top 25 was everything to get the level of exposure you would want to get actual valuable traffic. So you were willing to pay. And in those days, people were farming out of China. They were paying for installs, fake installs. People were doing everything possible. We ended up spending money with install providers, whether it's Facebook or other mobile apps, with the idea and the hope that ultimately the game would be successful. We'd done some beta testing. And this was the 3rd version, and it was actually a very dumbed down version. All other versions were actually synchronous, and this was asynchronous. We'd also made it non-competitive. The other ones were time-based or metric-based, meaning who won the most or who had the most points or who ultimately would win all the battles. And we went with a completely different approach of the notion of tossing the ball back and forth with Draw Something, and the aspiration, the fun of just drawing and sketching and other people guessing. And so we changed the mechanics. We also had the ability for you to see what the other person was drawing while you were guessing. And ultimately, it was meant to be a viral product. But when you build 30 plus games, with a team of 50 people, over a period of 2 or 3 years, you learn a lot of things, including multiple versions of this product. $62,000 spent on iOS and Android didn't get us in the top 25. We were number 26. And I stopped spending because then I wanted to understand what my lifetime value was going to be, what my retention rates were going to be, what my engagement rates were going to be. And then it just started kind of taking a life of its own. It started growing a little bit. The next week we ended up in the top 25. We'd done the usual cross promotion. If you have an audience segment, you always cross promote first. So you basically set a roadmap on the marketing side of saying, okay, let me introduce my audience to my own product. Let me use my various channels, whether it's social, whether it's email, whether it's Facebook, and see what the adoption rate is of my existing audience base. Get the data against that because they're always going to be more excited, more engaged, more stoked about you releasing another product and be more proactive around giving you feedback. And so existing user base are very valuable. And so I think we had about 30, 40,000 installs out of our own user base between web, mobile, and Facebook. And this was only our 2nd mobile game that we'd ever done. Everything else was web or Facebook. And as it happens, it grew. It grew, and it grew very fast. Now, we ultimately made over hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues. We had a retail game. We had a TV show. And yes, it went to 50 million installs in 50 days. It was the fastest growing app in the history at that time of the App Store. And it was global. And it sure was a lot of fun, and we sure looked like geniuses. And the reality is, my job as either CRO or Chief Business Development Officer is to maximize opportunities and asset value. I'm not a game developer. I'm not the product designer. And the circumstance of this product is a combination of a lot of very talented people who spend a lot of time together creatively through analytics, through data, through user testing, creating the best potential product. And so there are no successful companies without great product teams, without great engineers. Business people are not that useful. They're not that important for you to be successful as a company. Much more important are your PMs, your designers, and your engineers. They're ultimately the people who build the product. They need vision, they need direction, they need the opportunity to build things that are amazing. But guys like me are fairly useless unless you have a potential and there's people there. And that's why I get hired and join teams that are already kind of have a founder, have a PM, or have an engineer in place. But yeah, we ended up going to about 80 plus million installs before we ever spent a dollar again on advertising. You know, it took a life on its own and became very socially relevant. You know, people were tweeting about it. And actually, one of the things that was funny is that at first we didn't use Facebook Connect. And early on, people were like, oh, use Facebook Connect, you'll get viral. There was just enough friction in the game, in odd ways, in the acquisition funnel area, where people felt the need to go on Tumblr and the need to go on Twitter and other areas to find people to play with. They felt the need to tell their friends about it because they wanted people to draw with them. They wanted people to re-engage. And velocity of engagement is a really important part of ultimately retention, because if it's like a dating app, like Tinder, right? There's quite a few people in Belfast on Tinder. You know, but if there wasn't, Tinder wouldn't be so great, right? I mean, you fly around the world, I go everywhere, you go places, you have 5 profiles, you're like, wow, what a waste of, you know, Tinder in this, you know, in Park City, Utah, like whatever. So velocity of engagement and the retention around that velocity is extremely important to your organic, you know, viral factor. I mean, that is, you know, at the end of the day, the people who spoke here before me built great products that had great retention. And the principle in mobile is that retention comes first. If you can't retain your user in the first 7 days, understanding your curve of churn and where people are churning out of, if you can't understand what makes your product viral, you know, why they're inviting their friends, how they're discovering your product, it's very hard to ultimately optimize your product for growth. Because again, you know, at the end of the day, people are using your product because you've created value. It doesn't have to be new. There were 5 other Pictionary games before we released ours in the market. None of them were successful. So you don't have to create something completely new. You just have to create something that solves a problem for people in a better way than somebody else's. More efficient, faster, better design, cheaper. I mean, an example is Uber, you know, and all the other car companies right now around. Like, at the end of the day, it gets commoditized, it's logistics, and it's about which car comes first at the cheapest price, right? I mean, but, you know, if the cab's not around, which happens a lot, it's a great product. You're solving something very simple and basic. You know, is taking Lyft versus Uber in San Francisco very that much different because the guy's site is, you know, supposed to be nicer and you can sit in the front? Who gives a shit? I mean, I need to talk to my cab driver every time I get in the cab? No. So what I care about when I'm using Uber or Flight is, okay, which one's going to be cheaper and get to me faster and ultimately, you know, get to me where I need to go, you know, efficiently. And a lot of what you can build out there, a lot of what you can do as entrepreneurs is actually significantly improve on a lot of things that are out there that are simply broken or just not that efficient. Whether you think about Netflix and all these other companies that are extremely successful, they're not necessarily inventing the world. They're kind of making a better version of something that was already there that is either stodgy or costly or not efficient in usage. So yes, a lot of people used our product. A lot of celebrities used our product. It was heavily endorsed on Twitter. People were posting their images everywhere. They were, you know, screen capturing their pictures, posting it on Tumblr, putting their gamer tags all over the place. And that kind of propelled itself, you know, and then because the game was so wide-reaching, 14-year-old could play it, 50-year-old could play it. You then had multiple user segments and user profiles that could use your product. So we didn't have limits to demographic, geo, gender, or interest, because you didn't have to be a good, you know, somebody who knew how to draw to play the game, and it was a lot of fun. And you could be somebody who was super intense into the drawing, and people were like, wow, that's fucking amazing. And it didn't have restrictions in its ability to actually grow if people found it to be fun and at velocity could engage with a lot more people. And so we ended up reaching more than 200 million installs. We sold the company along the way. The game, you know, had 25 million daily active users, and at that time was probably one of the biggest games, you know, that year or in its history at that given moment. I think only Angry Bird had been bigger before. Words with Friends, Zynga may have been around the same size, but nobody had grown at our rate, which is why people were baffled that with no marketing dollars, no arbitrage, you know, that we could grow just by word of mouth, but just by engagement, just by the level of retention. We had like a 70 percentile plus first day retention. You know, we were still in the 40, 50 percentile first 30-day retention. And so our retention rate was hugely important to ultimately continue to grow virally. We also went beyond, you know, once you grew past your social graph, we went with allowing to match you with anybody else. So there's always somebody to play with. You could always retain all your matches. And again, velocity and density, so you didn't have to wait around. The waiting for engagement is something that most people don't have time for. You don't even want to wait 5 seconds to load your web page. So much less if you get into an app and there's no counterpart, no re-engagement. That will destroy your experience. And so what we did that worked out well for us, and why ultimately I seem like a genius having run the P&L and made over $100 million in just 24 months or 12 months. I mean, is we had already been doing this for years. Tracking, monetization, which was in-app purchases, which was a premium version, which was advertising. We were doing $15 to $20 million a quarter in advertising and sponsorships alone. But we had set all these things up. We had been preparing for years. We had been testing, evaluating, trying to understand why people would buy, what people would play, what people would pay for. And so when Draw Something as a product finally became a great product, finally was something that people really want to engage with, then the rest was like history. I mean, the rest was us grinding it out for several years before that and trying to do all the right things that when applied to a shitty product, doesn't matter how smart anybody is, you're not successful. And so we went from growing a $5 to $10 million P&L for 2 years, raising 10 more million bucks, from the SoftBank and Row Ventures, and and then a year and a half later, running out of cash because we grew on the team from 20 to 60 people, trying to do everything at once. So going back to the fundamentals, to going back to what we did well, which is let's just do casual games. We try to do RPGs on Facebook. We try to do farming games on Facebook. We try to do what everybody else was doing. And ultimately, it just wasn't in our core DNA. And when we went back to the basics and back to an experience that we knew well, that we knew how to design well, and that we had understood for years, we ultimately actually delivered a great game, a great product. And then my job became extremely easy on the marketing side, on the PR side, leaking the information every now and then about where we were in our growth, leveraging celebrities, leveraging sponsorships, bringing brands into your product, making it social relevance. Like, people want to be engaged in things that other people are engaged in as well. There's not a lot of products out there that you use that nobody else are using, because you're like, how good is this if nobody else talks about it, uses it, if nobody's endorsing it? And so, what ended up being a huge success here is a combination of years of failures and mistakes. And I think what you learn as entrepreneurs is ultimately that you made a lot of mistakes along the way with the wrong co-founders, the wrong technologies, the wrong development cycles, the wrong approach to marketing. But there's no one right path to whether or not you will be successful. There's fundamental things that you should consider, which we're spoken about, which is the right team, focusing on product quality, retention, evaluating your marketing channels, understanding your arbitrage, figuring out what and when you can spend. They're all things that apply to any business. But there's no one way to ultimately get to being extremely successful. If not, then we just have a PowerPoint and we just pass it around, and you guys would all be selling companies for $100 million. Like, it's just not how it works. We sold for the company for hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. And it was great. Since then, I joined Picsart, and Picsart is going to be 10 times the size of Draw Something. In the last 6 months alone, we added 60 million installs organically. We've passed 220 million organic installs. We have 60 million monthly active users. We'll pass probably 150 million monthly active users this year, which makes us the second largest photo-related app in the world after Instagram. And as an independent app, it makes us the largest app in the world. And we're completely different. It's a creative platform for expression, for creativity. It's a little bit of a takeoff on Draw Something, but it's much more sophisticated. It's like Adobe meets Instagram. It's about Generation 2.0, what Instagram created, which is people want to share, great. But they also want to be personalized. They also want to customize. They also want to express themselves, which is what Twitter allowed, which is what YouTube allows. And there's not been that in what is, I would say, the creative expression field, for people to co-edit other people's assets, to create together, as you do in open source code. Engineers do that all the time, and somehow when it comes to media or content, people aren't doing that. And so there's this huge opportunity in what we consider 2.0 mobile experience of content consumption and creation, to be creative and to express that. You have a billion smartphones coming to market globally, and this is 25 and under generations. Like, they're the stickers, the emojis, you want to have a little font, you want to have a little background. I mean, Instagram is tremendous. It's not a creative product. It's not a creative channel. It's a channel. It's a great one, 300 million monthly active users. That's very powerful. Then you've got the IMs of the world and the Vescos. They're like marketplaces for photographers who are trying to make a living. That's a micro market. We can blow that out of the water in a year with the size of the audience that we have, which is like 10x theirs, and get a few professionals who want scope, to be recognized and ultimately discovered. And so when you think about, at least from my segment, which is consumer mobile products, you really have to understand who you're offering your product to. And then you have to iterate and iterate. I mean, when Picsart came out, which is 3 years ago now, A couple of guys out of Armenia, software developers, had been doing a bunch of shitty games on MySpace, probably like 300 different little MySpace game, crappy crap, just enough to support their consulting business. Then Android came out in 2011. They're like, oh, let's try to go to Android. It's like the easiest way to kind of transfer code source development knowledge. They get to Android. They start doing a bunch of little crappy apps again. They get some traction. They get a portfolio. And then they realize that photo editing and photo or images is fairly popular. They merge their audience. They merge to a single product. And now they've got some level of scale. They've never spent $1 on acquiring users. Maybe 20 or 30,000 bucks, kind of testing some shit on Facebook. But at the end of the day, the product itself sells itself. Why? Because when people use mobile products with other people that they know around them, when people are seeing that content, they're seeing it on Instagram, on their Flickr, they're seeing it on their Facebook, they're like, oh shit, how did you do that? How did you or incorporate an image of somebody else, or write in there, or change the fonts, or do something really creative? We have 50% word of mouth growth. We have 45%, which comes from discovery on the app stores. We have over 4 million reviews out of 4.5+ stars, which is the largest in the world after Instagram on Android. They were amazing at doing ad hoc, fast development. They were releasing on a weekly basis their product, weekly releases for almost 2 years. Now we're 120 people at the company. We can't do that anymore. But the fact is that they were agile, they were creative. From the engineers, we barely had any PMs, but from the engineers, like across the entire team, people were thinking about how do you innovate, how do you release something that nobody else is doing, how do you deliver quality and experiences. And they went from doing photo editing to drawing, sketches, image editing, photo editing. Now we're going into video editing, we're going to GIF creations. And ultimately it's like, well, now that people are creating all this content, how do we migrate this into a community of creatives for discovery, for sharing, for consumptions, for learning, for being inspired? I mean, if you go on a lot of photo apps, it's super inspiring. Everybody in this room has some level of creativity. I mean, you're all entrepreneurs or want to be entrepreneurs or trying to build a company, or you're part of a company. So inherently, you're creative in some way, shape, or form. And so for us, it's just tapping into this notion that for thousands of years, everybody has some level of creativity. Now you've got 1 billion smartphones out there coming on top of the ones that are already out there to support real-time creativity, real-time expression, which is what YouTube delivered, and it's extremely successful. We're doing the same, but for content and images. And at the end of the day, it comes down to, again, retention and engagement. We have a 60% first-month retention rate. We know, for example, that if somebody edits an image the first day, there's a 90% chance that 7 days later, they're still there. We know that if they like an image or follow somebody in the first day, we know that there's a 75% chance that they're still going to be there a week later. And so you just try to understand what are the triggers around your product, what are the triggers around why it's growing, what are the triggers around what's being, what's creating consumption and re-engagement, and you amplify those. You're solving for problems. You're solving for what ultimately makes you have a business, which is over the long term, which is people getting into your product every day, people using your product, people talking about your product, delivering great experiences. I would say intrinsically, did we make a mistake selling to Zynga? A little bit. There's 10 other companies who wanted to buy our company at OMG Pop. Zynga was aggressive. Did we sell too early? I don't think so. The market decides when you should sell. But they weren't as creative as we were. They were completely data-driven, right? And they were really about like the funnel and optimization of the funnel and the arbitrage, and it was like a machine in there, right? And Zynga is very data analytically driven, and we built our entire product on creativity and understanding our users' emotional attachments and excitement, and all the kind of more emotional people factor that made the product successful. When we got overridden from, well, let's copy everything that Word with Friends did successfully into draw something, before you know it, our users are like, this sucks. This is not what I like. This is not what we do. This is not what the game's about. Brand management is super important. I mean, they were talking about this before. Like, Zynga did a terrible job at brand managing draw something and OMG Pop. And immediately people were like, well, wow, they didn't go to 50 million DAUs from 25. That's a fucking failure. But we had tens of millions of DAUs for 6 to 12 months. And we still have 1 million DAU in the game today almost, 3 or 4 years later, which by any metrics is still a very large number of users in a casual game on mobile. And so a lot of it's perception. When the momentum's building, you have to drive that momentum. You got to do your PR, you got to get on the panels, you got to propagate and propaganda, you got to market the machine, right? And there's 1 million channels to do that. You got to find your sweet spots based on your audience. Some of your audience segments are huge on Twitter. Some of them are huge on Facebook. Some of them go to conferences, depending on your product. Some of them, are going to be watching TV. Like, there's no one channel that works for everybody, because you have to ultimately understand where your user segment is adopting or consuming or viewing what you're sharing. And so, you have to understand your audience segment to ultimately market to the right channels. So all channels aren't valuable. The arbitrage model, it depends where you are. I'm in California. They'll give you $50 million before you make a dime, and as long as you're growing, they don't really care. They give you another 50 million, right? If you're in New York, financial capital of the world, like, they care a little bit more about your P&L and where your business model is going. If you're in Europe, nobody gives you a dime unless you're already profitable. That's a little bit challenging, and it takes a lot more smart guys like these guys to pull that off out of the gate. Our company's been profitable at Picsart for 2 years. European founders, bootstrapped. And then we go raised a round by Sequoia, which I led, and there's a lot of other firms that were tremendous firms that wanted to join in. Sequoia is obviously in WhatsApp and Instagram, and they were the original investors in Apple. And so it's great to have people supporting your vision. We actually didn't need the capital, which is why, in relative terms, $10 million is a very small round for a company our size. If you think about the valuations and the sizes of the round of what Snapchat's doing at $500 million, $16 billion, WhatsApp sold for $22 billion when it had 500 million monthly active users. Instagram sold for $1 billion with 30 million monthly active users. Tango, which is a communication app trying to be in the line cacao area, $1.5 billion valuation with $378 million raised. Like, our 10 million with what is now 16 million monthly active users is, in retrospect, very small amount. The difference is what are you trying to achieve? They mentioned the profitability, sustainability, owning and running a business that has meaningful value over the long term. We have a combination of being American and being European, and so we're taking that middle ground, which is, could I raise 50 million at 300 million valuation? Yeah. Then you get some guys busting your balls every quarter about where you're going. What's next? How much money are you going to make? When are you going to make your money? You lose control. And by losing control, you lose direction, you lose your focus, because now everybody else is telling you how to run your business because they have expectations that you have to meet for them. We have an amazing founder, Hovannes, who's 50. He's bootstrapped and sold a few other companies. And all we care about is focusing on our vision, focusing on defining what ultimately creates the most amount of value for our users, and how we amplify that value. So we have no social brand recognition. Like, most of you never heard of Picsart. Most people in the US, even though we have tens of millions of monthly active users there, never heard of us. So we're working now with companies and trying to establish relationships with William Morris Endeavor. We're working with Getty Images. We're trying to work with Refine 29. We're working with Facebook very closely and Google. And you ultimately put yourself in the position to be a part of the conversation. And if you're going to grow a big business and you want to be adopted at scale, being a part of the conversation is very important. And it's not just the PR conversation, even though that's important. It's the everyday conversation, right? And you have to become socially relevant if you are going to be a mobile, scalable product. And so you have to find ways of making that happen. That's a part of the focus. Part of the focus is BD. Which partners on a technology standpoint, which partners on a distribution standpoint, can amplify your reach, your penetration, your brand power. So in Asia, which is a tremendous market, we're talking to Line, and we're talking to Kakao, we're talking, with Baidu, we're talking to Xiaomi, which is one of the gigantic unicorns. They call them dragons now. I don't know if you guys follow that the unicorns have now moved on to dragons because they're so big in the billions of dollars valuation that unicorns are like, everybody's a unicorn, and you got to be a dragon. So, the market's changed, right? And it just depends where you are and what you're trying to achieve. So I don't think there's one right way. We did a few things wrong. We did a few things right. They've done a lot of things right. They've done a lot of things wrong. If you're doing a SaaS business, what I'm telling you, only so much apply, because it's a different market. You need salespeople, you need different levels of capital, different marketing, strategies. You got to think about your clients and ramping up, your revenue run rate and booking them and upselling them. It's a completely different business. So Picsart draws something very similar. Wide audience segments, global audience segment, all mobile, and ultimately it comes down to what is your intrinsic value proposition that nobody else is delivering on? And what we're doing, for example, to really, really focus on defining ourselves differently from an Instagram or a Snapchat is we're actually creating an algorithm around what defines what we consider beauty. And in a simple way, we like to think that we're going to beautify the world, right? And so to us, beauty is the notion that somebody invested in creating something. There should be some level of consumption for that creation because the creator is looking for some level of recognition. Whether it's friends, family, he's looking for a certain number of likes, he's looking for a number of comments, engagements, because that's what's going to motivate him to come back. That's why we post on Facebook. Hey, how many people looked at my kid's picture, right? I'm a terrible dad. I post all of my kids' pictures all the time. Right? But ultimately, that's what people do. Right? You want some kind of social recognition, whether it's personal, whether it's your business, and so the recognition of your creation as an artist, whether you're doing selfie-edited and pushing it to your Instagram, whether you're doing a drawing for 3 days and pushing it into Picsart, like you want people to see that. That's why you're investing in it. And so we're creating these algorithms around minimum threshold of what ultimately considers beauty. It's not a notion of what we think is nice or not nice. It's a question of how many people are ultimately going to consume it. If we find a way to improve the ability for people to create and the ability for people to consume, then we're matching what is ultimately most important, which is people want to find things that they like, they care about, that they are enthusiastic about, that they find value in, and people who are creating that value want to be found. So when you solve that minimum algorithm, that threshold of, well, is it 5 likes, 10 views, 2 comments, right? Then we've done something really well because we're matching people with their counterparts, if you will. And when you do that at scale, we don't need to deliver 80 million photos every day to Instagram that are uploads where you have 90% of them that nobody gives a shit about. Then you're delivering 20, 30 million images that are actually being consumed and people are intrinsically finding real value in. And that's a very, very different approach because then our entire focus on our product, on our UX, UI, on our strategy is around that algorithm of notion of what is creation for those who are using, what is value for those who are using our product on both sides of the consumption and on the side of the creators. We have about 20 to 30% of our user base who are creators, right? That's about, and I think Pinterest has about less than 5% of people who are creating pages for people to pin. I think, YouTube has about 10% of creators. So we're at a much higher velocity of creators of content of various formats. And we want to continue that by innovating around that. At the same time, we want hundreds of millions of people to consume that content. And so our focus is constantly about refining and evaluating the virality, the discovery, whether it's tagging, images, location, search, recommendation, your social graph, all these, things, categories that you like, recommendations of other categories, the hashtag categories, socially relevant content, contest, and then this notion of co-editing and co-creation. If I put an image up, not of my son, but let's say of the Grand Canyon, the fact that somebody around the world, dozens of people around the world, hundreds of people around the world who have never been to the Grand Canyon can now interact with that image or that video and create something that's personal to them and share it with others, it's hugely powerful and unique. The notion that I could create something in this room using 10 people's different assets that they create on our platform on a marketplace basis, which is you create a logo, you create an image, you create a frame, and now I'm compiling something and creating, off of your creations, or that we will all create together. You're great with the framing, I'm great with taking the pictures, somebody's great with the editing, and then you create marketplaces around that. Today we generate money through advertising and in-app purchases. But in future, it's about marketplace. It's about peer-to-peer acquisition. You create something amazing, I wanted that on my lock screen. Can I just buy it from you? If you're in Asia or if you're Pinterest, it's about commerce, right? So all the data that you're capturing around, I think we've had almost 2 billion images created through our platforms. We deliver, millions of images every day to Facebook and Instagram and other platforms. And so commerce is very interesting to us over the long term. The ability for people who are in a certain location, who view a certain something, and I'm not talking about print and image, I'm talking about true commerce, a recommendation of for traveling, shopping, fashion, cars, whatever that may be, because over time we've collected so much data, so much information on the user, so much information on the creations, the locations, the hashtagging, artificial intelligence, image recognition, things that we're working on with companies like Intel, Google, Samsung, right? There's so many people to work with for what is very powerful technologies that constantly, enable and support deeper and better engagement. And we're hyper-focused on that. We're constantly working with Facebook. We'll be at F8 at the conference on new initiatives there. We're working with depth photography with Intel, which is just amazing. Basically, if I took an image here right now, it would be flat. But depth photography allows you to deconstruct the image on actual dimensions. And then I could move you guys around in a 3D way, and I could place you behind them, and the Technology would recognize the distance between the two of you as well as the wall behind and replace you in the right setting and rezoom against what I ultimately choose. I could put a GIF image of a little bird flying around your head who would recognize the distance between you and the person behind you as well as to me, and be able to perfectly gravitate the image around you as if it was three-dimensional. It would allow me to zoom on this side of the room, because there's one pretty girl over there, and then these guys over here, and then brush out that side of the image. Right? There's a million things that ultimately technology supports. There's dual image capture. There's just a lot of things. On the drawing side, there's a million things we're doing. Giphies have become very popular. There's this company in New York City called Giphy, raised $17 million. It's like the largest library of search for Giphy images. So that's a very popular way for people to interact and socialize. And so it's about constantly innovating and finding ways to create value for your users. And when you do that, your users come back more often, they retain yourself, and you have a long-term business. We've grown our P&L by 100% the past 6 months. We'll grow it another 100% this year. And we're profitable. I mean, I'm hiring 30 people right now in San Francisco. We have 100 people in Europe. We're still profitable. So you can blend things that are important in terms of independence, which is profits, which allows you to control your destiny, without over-investing in how profitable you are, because ultimately R&D and innovation and product quality and the talent that you need to ultimately grow your product is more important than pure profits in itself. Having a bunch of money in the bank that you don't use has no real intrinsic value to the long-term growth of a company. When you're Apple and you've got $200 billion in the bank, that's because for the past decade you've been innovating and churning out amazing products that ultimately deliver a lot of cash flow. But their R&D is huge. They've just outgrown their R&D level where now they can never outspend themselves, in terms of innovation. So there's, those are all the circumstances to why, Picsart is going to be a $1 billion company. It's exactly for all the reasons that I mentioned. Why was this a great success? For all those reasons I mentioned. But the guys before I joined Picsart had done hundreds of apps. Hundreds. Before ultimately they came onto something, to understanding where they'd gone short. And to their credit, they were in Armenia. I mean, 90% of the people in this room probably doesn't know where Armenia is, right? So it's like the tie between Turkey and Iran, right? It's like not where you go every weekend for vacation. Ex-Soviet Union country, old Christian country. I get introduced by Greylock, which is a huge VC at SF. They're looking for somebody to take them from being an unknown Armenian powerhouse that's growing faster than anybody else out there to being a U.S. entity that ultimately everybody will know and will end up with hundreds of millions of users and be a multi-billion-dollar company. But they made that bold move to say, you know what, we can't win at executing on the potential of our vision from where we are. They had enough of a product to be able to interact with people in California and the Valley. I was in New York running a tech company. I decided to move to San Francisco. You have to also understand, what is it going to take for you to actually get to where you want to go? What sacrifices do you have to make? Whether it's not eating, whether it's not seeing your wife or your girlfriend for a week, whether it's moving your kids around. Those are all things that ultimately, as an entrepreneur, you have to place bets on. That's the real risk about being an entrepreneur. It's not whether or not your product's going to fail. It's all the personal risks you're taking. You can always find a job, right? But you're putting yourself in, I would say, emotionally challenging situations that either have very positive or very negative impact on your holistic life. And so they made the bold move. It was a perfect match in terms of what they did and what I did. We raised a round with Sequoia in 2 weeks. It was as much fun as selling OMG Pop. Kleiner Perkins and all those guys meeting us. We had, in 6 days, we had a term sheet from Sequoia with everything that we wanted. And, I told the CEO who had never raised VC money, enjoy it. It's never going to be like this again. Because raising money is extremely brutal, painful, and unpleasant because everybody's trying to downsize you, trash you for what you're not worth, and then give you money at their valuation, which is a super comforting way of starting a relationship. But the guy who invested in WhatsApp, he at the end of the second partner meeting, because you have to meet all the partners at Sequoia, every single partner has to sign off on the investment. And the guy who invested in WhatsApp is like, right at the end of the meeting, he's like, can I take a picture with you guys and the logo? Because my daughter's a huge fan. And I was like, okay, we got this deal. When people draw something, I was going everywhere, the deli guy, the cab driver, every time I was wearing my pin or somebody saw the logo, everybody knew the product. It's immensely rewarding. I mean, that's the most rewarding about being an entrepreneur, is when people recognize your brand and and thank you for the experience that you're creating for them. You know, it's not about the money and the outcome. It's never as fun as people think to sell a company. But the journey of building something that ultimately becomes hugely valuable to people should always be your #1 focus. You know, your visions may change. Look at Zuckerberg. I mean, Facebook 10 years ago, yeah, a couple of images for students. I mean, today it's a completely different business. It's a completely different world. You know, there's no end to your vision as long as you want to grow your vision and grow onto the challenge. But you got to start somewhere delivering something very specific that you can focus on that's intrinsically extremely valuable. Get the right people to do that. And once you get traction with that, you know, then you staff, then you bring on people like me, then you bring on more money, and then everything else falls into place.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I think, has anybody got one quick question? We're kind of running out of time, but if anybody's got one quick question for anybody? Oh, here's one up here, sorry. I'll run back. We're going to have similar discussions tonight at the Friday night mashup, I'm sure. So,
Wilson, just wanted to ask, any issues around copyright with the images and stuff?
Yeah, so the biggest issue there is often between users. You know, we take the same approach as YouTube, which is we have licensing rights, but we don't own it, so we don't get sued. But we can do what we want with it. And the challenge is often that other users will complain that other users are using their assets without permission, or using assets from other environment and taking credit for it. So creators, and intrinsically, or a portion of our creators, are much more invested than the selfie generation of 18 and under, who really doesn't care. They're doing short-term edit, whatever, click-clack, posting on Facebook with a few things here and there. You know, the mom who's doing a little montage of her kids' pictures and Christmas, and maybe an album photo, and she's posting it on Facebook or emailing it. She's not really a part of that concern. You know, the concern comes around if the photographers, the professional artists, the artists, the people who are investing, you know, 3 or 4 days creating a drawing, and ultimately somebody else just takes it. And so we have, you know, obviously a fair amount of complaints around that. And those are part of the challenges and issues that you have when you grow, which is data privacy, you know, and then your terms of services, terms of conditions. You know, we're doing a deal with Getty Images right now where we're going to get access to their library of assets, which is extremely exciting because that means that anybody in our platform will be able to work with or work around or edit Getty Images. And you know, whether it's a Muhammad Ali image or whatever else, and that's extremely exciting. And then there's a lot of, you know, sensitive points around can they sell it, where can they repost it, and so you have to redefine those things. And we're actually constantly evolving our terms of services and terms of conditions to match our business model and match what consumers are ultimately doing with your product in real time.
Great. Thanks again, Wilson. So, folks, I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly found it really enjoyable hearing all the stories. I hope you learned some stuff that you can take away and apply to your own products and ideas. Please send me any feedback to sandy@techstartni.com. And if you've got any ideas for any other workshops, please give me them. If you could just thank the speakers again, that'd be really good. Thanks.